first speaker of the Affirmative team to open today's debate.
Hypocrisy is not an effective tool to keep people in line. Rather, hypocrisy is a way for people to add extra weight to claims which they wouldn't have otherwise and prevent people from evaluating ideas critically. 3 things for you in this speech. First of all, an explanation for what we stand for and the way that we're going to win this debate. And second of all, an explanation of the way that individuals are likely to react to, and then how that is going to have flow-on effects and affect the actions of politicians, business people, social movements, and wider society. So first of all, we think that destigmatization would mean that there is no longer an accepted norm that hypocrisy is always bad in and of itself, right? We think that this means that in a world where hypocrisy is something which exists as a norm, people are likely to evaluate that as a heuristic which is necessarily bad. In the same way that people think that something like democracy is always good because it has been ingrained in us through like liberal values and norms and narratives that, democracy is just the best way to run a country, right? This also means that people are likely to have a knee-jerk reaction to hypocrisy, like immediately, because without evaluating it, because it is something that they have always taken as being bad for their entire lives. We also think that hypocrisy is like opposing something just based on a contradiction, right? It looks like someone driving a gas-guzzling car and then feeling like they can't support an environmental movement because they think that it is hypocritical to do something which slightly harms the environment, right? We think that hypocrisy is not any one specific action, rather it is that general clash between principles that individuals might have. This is a very important distinction we think that needs to be drawn in this debate. So first of all, how do we think an individual is likely to react in a world without hypocrisy? First, we want you to know that people have sets of principles with which they use to make decisions, and they hold these principles like independently. When hypocrisy is something which exists in a norm, it is one of the principles people use to make decisions when they decide to commit to political movements, when they decide whether or not someone is worth supporting or a belief is being worth held. This is something that they will hold in the same regard as when they're making other decisions. For example, when they look at a politician, they'll think they've been hypocritical. That is something that I should weigh equally with, the harms of them, like maybe supporting and I should weigh that against maybe them supporting positive social movements. Maybe I should weigh that against them, supporting climate change bills, because I think that hypocrisy is something that is bad in and of itself. We also think that this knee-jerk reaction generally means that people are less likely to make a way up between issues because they think that hypocrisy is a principal point at which they stop, right? They think, well, this person has been slightly hypocritical, I shouldn't trust them anymore, I shouldn't support them. However, I think this knee-jerk reaction prevents them from making the way up between whether or not this will be a good or a bad thing, right? We have a few examples of the cases when we think this is likely to happen. Before I go through that, I'll take a POI before I go through.
Do you believe that hypocrisy can be an effective tool in either changing a person's actions?
No, we think that hypocrisy is generally used to prevent people from making principled decisions. It's actually used to occlude larger principles, and I'm going to explain how that's used by politicians and business people to manipulate individuals. So, a few different examples of this. First of all, affirmative action, right? We think that there is a clash if I'm a liberal who on face value opposes something like racism, when I look at affirmative action, I might think, well, some people are being given an advantage over others on the basis of their race. Isn't that slightly racist? Because that is because I stop at the point when it is hypocritical. However, when I no longer think hypocrisy is something which is necessarily bad, and I take it a little bit further, I can see that these people have been consistently disadvantaged, that this is not hypocrisy, that this hypocrisy isn't the worst thing, because actually the people who have not had opportunities are being given better opportunities. It also looks like something like nuclear power. You feel like developing nuclear research programs is necessarily bad because that means you necessarily necessarily need to support nuclear weapons. It will be hypocritical if you support nuclear power. However, nuclear power could be some kind of alternative, as an alternative which you could use to power systems and which could be like supportive for social movements, right? But note here the important and the more generalizable point here is that when you use hypocrisy as a way to evaluate issues, you are not evaluating them on the basis of their merits, you are evaluating them on the basis of a principle and the clashes between principles. We do not think this is a way to critically think through situations, and I think it is actually utilized as such by politicians and business people. First of all, politicians need the support of individuals to get into power. Therefore, we think they are likely to make changes to their policies and their platforms on the basis of how people will support them. We think that politicians often use hypocrisy as a form of personal attack because it is a very effective way to convince people that they should not support a specific candidate because, for example, if I am a right-wing candidate, and I point out that my left-wing candidate, flies in planes, and planes are really harmful to the environment. So, maybe environmentalists shouldn't go out to vote for them, even if they don't necessarily come and support me, because they feel like that person is being harmful, just because they think that they're contradicting their principles. However, on net, if you voted for that left-wing candidate, they are the one who is more likely to support positive climate change action, even though they are doing things which are necessarily contradictory to the climate movement. We think that this is often used as a way for politicians to distract from their actual policies because it is something that they can get to in the psyche of an individual and just use them to distract them from critical thinking about ideas. Second of all, we think business people also need to care about the actions of individuals because they are the people who are buying their products. If I'm a business person and I need to convince people that my brand is worth buying from because there is likely competition, right? So if someone doesn't want to buy from my brand, they can go and buy from someone else. But second of all, because we think that people can support policies through the government, which necessarily could potentially hurt my business if I don't support things which work with these people. An example of this could be the use of business people talking about individual burdens of climate change, right? Your individual ecological footprint is very harmful when they point out that you drive a car. How can you support climate change when that is something you stand for? However, we think that it is very likely that they are doing that because they just went and spilled 4 million gallons of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, which we think is a much greater net harm. However, you feel like you are less able to oppose that morally because you would be a hypocrite who is driving a gas-guzzling car. But when there is no longer hypocrisy, the way you feel is that, well, maybe I'm driving this gas-guzzling car, but on net, it is more harmful for this company to be spilling 4 million gallons of oil. Maybe I should boycott them. Maybe I should go for more climate protection policy, right? Note here that if they try and tell us, well, people are already making these evaluations on the basis of the harm to the system or the harm to the individual. They're not just going to support a company because they tell them they're being harmful. They are undermining any benefit they could get from claiming that hypocrisy is something which tries to keep people in line, because actually they need to support a form of hypocrisy which affects the decisions which people are making. Finally, on social movements. We think that social movements often support things which go against the status quo. However, they also support things which, if you were to examine the facts on each side, would probably come out as a net good for that social movement. However, when detractors are able to point to something like hypocrisy, which is a very big norm in society, and say, well, this is something that they are doing, then you are able to undermine that social movement, not based on the merits of their actions, but instead on the basis of an incredibly nebulous concept of hypocrisy.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I now invite the first negating speaker. You can unplug it from the wall side.
I can just...
Yeah, just unplug it.
At the point where your coaches force you to never outro with proud to oppose, but there are videos floating around on YouTube of them doing exactly that, that's where destigmatized hypocrisy becomes ineffective, because you question what is the value of their word if they don't stand by it themselves. On setup here, what do we support? We support holding people to account and incentivizing or forcing necessary change. We think that stigmatized hypocrisy is the best way to do this. What does this look like? It looks like calling out the US when they criticize other nations for not meeting their emission goals, to where you have to go into class and take off your jacket, but Mr. Joe Bloggs is still wearing his. In these cases where you feel unheard of or unfairly treated, it's totally understandable that people try to get their voices heard and seek justice. We're also happy to support harsher stigma on these forms of hypocrisy to get better net outcomes. For example, by not using a news outlet because they have hypocritical columnists. What does their world necessarily have to look like? We agree mostly with most of the framing that they gave us, but we just want to reinforce that they have to support, tentatively overlooking these companies or governments when they call out others when they're doing something bad themselves, and we probably get less social cohesion. This means that when you have people like Trump or like Biden calling out other smaller nations for not meeting their climate goals, then that means that you probably are going to overlook that because you don't see it as an issue in your society. Ultimately, on our side, what we support is calling these people out and trying to get some sort of outcome there. They also have to support, notably, probably a world with more hypocrisy because it's less stigmatized, which means that more people are likely to buy into it. How do we win this debate? It's by proving that people are discouraged to change and buy in to the word of others in a world where hypocrisy is destigmatized. 3 arguments today. Firstly, on how destigmatized hypocrisy leads to less social cohesion. Secondly, how current hypocrisy upholds accountability. And then Nathan, thirdly, is going to talk to you about the increased pressures on vulnerable groups. But before that, a few things on rebuttal here. So what did we hear substantively from AF? We heard these things like, look, affirmative action is really good, and that politicians use hypocrisy to call out, to distract from their actual policy, like, for example, right-wing politicians calling out left-wing candidates who use cars. Ultimately, we tell you that this form of hypocrisy is good in the sense that we're able to get, this hypocrisy being stigmatized is good, because when you see this, it means that you are able to hold this left-wing candidate to account and get them to try to cut down on their use of cars and climate emissions. Ultimately, under their side, what they have to support is people not necessarily buying into this and not being able to substantively respond to these forms of hypocrisy. That means that when you have people doing bad things and you try to call them, or you cannot call them out on this hypocrisy because it's destigmatized, because no one thinks that it's necessarily a bad thing. This means that you probably get less buy-in and social cohesion in the sense that you're not able to call out things that are bad, and that under our side we provide you with that alternative of getting people to do what is right. On to my first point then, on how destigmatized hypocrisy leads to less social cohesion. A bit of context here. When global actors and even everyday people engage in hypocrisy, we notice that and criticize it. For example, when a senior tells you to pull up your socks, even if theirs are at their ankles, you notice that they're being unfair and you call them out on it. A few mechanisms in this point. Firstly, there's more hypocrisy in the world currently. There's more hypocrisy in their world and backlash towards hypocrites. There tends to be more backlash towards hypocrites on the media and also in day-to-day encounters. Secondly, people don't like being told what to do if the person who is instructing them don't do it themselves, and there's this overwhelming form of injustice that people sense within society, in the sense that when you see this form of hypocrisy and you feel a form of injustice, when you have it stigmatized, you are able to call it out and say that it is a bad thing, and you can say that we do not like it. Ultimately, what they have to support under the comparative is this not being supported, in the sense that we're not calling out these forms of hypocrisy and we're not calling out these forms of injustice. Thirdly then, you feel less able to do things and improve the situation. For example, when the US isn't meeting their climate emission goals and other countries, and they're calling out other countries for not doing the same thing, ultimately what you get is people feeling like these smaller nations not feeling as if they can do the same thing. If a global superpower is not able to meet their climate emission goals, and you're trying to tell a developing nation who probably has far less money, then they're far less incentivized to actually engage in trying to lower their emission goals or like, meet their emission goals if they're unable to do it, if the US is unable to do it. What does this look like? What does this look like under our side? It looks like telling the US that they're not doing enough for climate change and that global actors calling them out. Why is the US more likely to change under our side? Because of their diplomatic incentives. In the sense that Biden will lose voters and people feel disenfranchised. You are protesting against this overwhelming form of hypocrisy and you're able to call out governments when they do things that are bad. And other nations are calling you out and less likely to work with you because you're not upholding your responsibility as the US government. When the US doesn't act on climate change, it shows that smaller nations can't and therefore are less likely to because a global power cannot. The outcomes here is that you get less social buy-in, people lose trust in their institutions, and you end up with less social change because people do not buy into it. The impacts here are rather great in the sense that people are not able to call out things that they see are bad because hypocrisy is not this thing that we think is bad. We say that hypocrisy is calling out hypocrisy is a very important tool to try and engage with things that are going on that are bad and trying to seek social reform. Ultimately, they cannot do that, and we get all these benefits of being able to get larger social buy-in and people having more tools to address injustice. Before my second point on how current hypocrisy upholds accountability, I'll take a point of information.
Why would Biden not be losing votes from a discussion about how he has had climate inaction and is hurting climate change as well?
Sure, we're happy to say that, but we say that we get that under our side in the sense that you're able to call out Biden for not doing lots, but it's hammered down even further, and you're able to hold him to an even higher level of accountability when he's doing these things of hypocrisy, in the sense that if he does not meet his own emission goals, and then he goes up to a much further extent of telling off another country for not doing the same things, we say that it's even worse, and we're able to claim that under our side as well. Now then on to how current hypocrisy upholds accountability. A bit of context here. When hypocrisy is stigmatised, it is seen as a really negative thing that people are willing to go to lengths to avoid being called a hypocrite. The mechanisms here are threefold. Firstly, the average reasonable person wants to believe that they are a good person, and being called a hypocrite challenges that view. Therefore, they are held accountable for their own actions in the sense that they don't want to be called out as being a hypocrite and being framed as a bad person, so they're less likely to act in these bad ways. In our world, we're able to foster that because people are able to be called out, and being called a hypocrite has negative connotations. Secondly, governments want to be perceived as personal and in touch with their people. Hypocrisy is a way of ensuring that they do not trivialise the problems of an everyday person. They have to ensure that their actions are representative of the way they want citizens to behave. For example, Chris Luxon getting called out massively when he was cutting wasteful spending while he was also receiving a government allowance to pay for his apartment. Ultimately, when we saw people calling him out, he said, no, I'm not going to take that anymore. That's like a discrete benefit that we're able to claim in the sense that we get people to actually have some sort of change and holding these politicians to account. The outcomes here is that people are held accountable for the impacts of their own actions, and the size of impact is so great because we're able to hold politicians to a high level of account, and we're able to bring social change. Ultimately, because we can bring you to a high level in society and we hold politicians to a high level and standard, we win this debate. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I now welcome up the second speaker of the Affirmative team.
So 3 things for you in this speech today. The first being what actually happens to accountability in society. That's broadly to do with politicians and businesses. And the second being which actually produces good social outcomes for society in general. And the third being a quick point on radicalization and why this occurs. So under this point of accountability, the big push we've seen from NEG is that basically people will avoid doing bad things in the fear of seeming hypocritical, and so therefore, like, we have a better world. But we think what actually happens is hypocrisy, by definition, just dismisses ideas at the baseline, right? It just dismisses what they're actually doing in favor of telling them they're a bad person because they're lying, rather than telling them they're a bad person or a company for dumping 4 million gallons of oil in the ocean, right? So we think that what's really, really important in this debate is the fact that without hypocrisy, without the stigmatization of hypocrisy, companies are more accountable for their actions because they cannot just simply pass on the blame, right? We've seen this with BP when they dumped all this oil in the ocean and people went that's a really bad thing, but then they invented this idea of the carbon footprint of everyone and made everyone feel really, really bad for actually polluting the environment themselves. So at the point where this company made you feel hypocritical for criticizing them because you were driving a car, it created this little bubble for them, which meant that they didn't have to be accountable to the public at all, because they could just point out that the public was being hypocritical, when in fact it's just not reasonable for the entire population of the world to stop driving cars, because that's a legitimate means of living your life at the moment, right? And so we think in the same way this happens in politics, right? So you've said that we'll be able to call out the US for criticizing others for not completing their emissions targets, and we think that the focus of the conversation in this case ends up being shifted from whether the US, the government in power, is being hypocritical and lying to people and not doing what they said they would, rather than actually the fact that they are polluting things, and focus on ways that we can change that, which is a much more productive conversation to be having if we actually want to prove we actually want to create any social change and any good outcomes. We also think under this that it's the backlash that happens on media when the focus is on just being hypocritical and lying about something. We think that it's much more beneficial for a politician to have to do things based off of principles that are correct, right? So we don't see them, no thank you, if they're they're not actually accountable to do the best thing in all situations, as long as they can prove that the things that they are doing sort of agree with their vague base principle line that their political party runs with, right? So what do we actually see happening? We see these political parties basically relying on votes of these people whose identity is basically based off of being a right-winger, and so on the baseline, they believe in these ideas, and so they're willing to believe any policy that this party puts out that vaguely relates to those ideas, and are not willing to question those things, right? So we see this lack of accountability for politicians because they can rely on these people who are so afraid of being hypocritical towards their base ideas that they will just support the radical side, and I'm going to get to that more a little bit later. So where are we at this point in the debate? We've proved to you that accountability is better for businesses and it's better for politicians when there is no stigmatization of hypocrisy, because the focus is shifted towards actual outcomes. Now the second point of clash that we're sort of seeing here is this point of good social outcomes. So I've already spoken about this a little bit, but I'm just going to expand on what my first speaker spoke about in terms of social movements, right? So at the moment, social movements tend to be quite inaccessible in a world where hypocrisy is extremely stigmatized, right? Because if I have to drive a car to get to work because I cannot afford to be wasting time to ride my bicycle to work instead, because I have 4 children at home and I need that car, I feel like I cannot go to work and tell people, yes, we should be doing more to support the environment. I cannot go to work and say, maybe we shouldn't have so much plastic packaging on our work catered lunches, and say something to your operations team. So we think that it makes it really inaccessible for people to participate in really important social movements and do things that they think will be able to support the world, because there are barriers to them doing that when they cannot change basic things that allow them to survive, right? People who do not have a lot of money, who do not have a lot of social capital, cannot afford to be making extreme changes to their lives and support the radical sides of these social movements and do everything they can to stop these things from happening. But what they can do is these small changes, and they can still in their hearts support a movement while still knowing that there are some things, there are some concessions that they will have to make because like that is how they have to live their lives. And so what happens is we get more buy-in to social movements, we see more pressure on like political parties also to do good things because they are seeing that more people actually do believe in this movement, and so we get better social change in these situations. So this point on radicalization is that like when you grow up with, actually I'll take a peel while I move on.
So when a politician's actions clash, like their actions clash with their principles, do you think they're more likely to change their actions or their principles?
We think that politicians at the moment make decisions based off of like their vague party line and make policies that agree with the base principles there without actually getting any of the benefit of like nuanced policy. I'm just going to talk about that now. So under the side of the house where hypocrisy is extremely stigmatized, what we have is you grow up with sort of an identity of political beliefs as you're growing up, right? That can be affected by like who your family is, who you sort of hang out with when you're like a teenager or a young adult, like what's the sort of media you're like consuming, and so you grow up with a base set of principles that you think are correct from like a relatively young age, right? You think that something is wrong and you're unlikely to change that in any scenario because you think that like if you believe in one thing, like it's just so wrong for you to believe in like that principle being applied differently anywhere else, right? So we have this large group of people who do not actually evaluate the harms of their actions because they see it as a violation of their own identity, right? So like we see individuals having to push towards the radical left and the radical right when in reality they don't stand for those sides of the political spectrum, right? Because they feel like they have to defend something at the point where they say that like, yes, we should be supporting climate change emissions targets, they like feel like they have to defend a position where they like shouldn't be driving a car, where they should be like cycling to work, where no one should like workplaces shouldn't have lights or anything like that, right? We think that when you have to push people to the radical left and right, that happens under hypocrisy because you feel like you cannot support one thing without supporting another. So politicians end up relying on these voting blocks, which I've already talked about, and which makes it really easy for them to radicalize. And this group in the middle just aren't represented in the political system. They aren't able to like have policies that actually support these people. We miss out on the legitimate benefits of broad principles applied differently in different contexts. For example, like anti-nuclear weapons, but nuclear power allowing us to move fully to nuclear weapons. And we get better social cohesion because if everyone's just always against each other all the time, then we'll never achieve any social outcomes.
The speaker for their speech, and then I welcome up the second speaker of the negating team.
Am I all good to start? I'm going to be going over two key areas in this speech. Firstly, the idea of what does hypocrisy actually look like on either side of the house, and then secondly, this big idea of social impacts. Under that, firstly, like dealing with the material and social movements, and then my split on like vulnerable groups in society and how they are negatively affected under the next side of the house. So firstly then, on what does hypocrisy actually look like on either side of the house. Under neg, we heard this like big point as like hypocrisy is a way for people to like start as a base point to start judging things based on principle. Firstly, I just want to flag, like I've got a few responses here. Firstly, it's just that we weren't really stepped out through this like really well. Like I'm still quite confused as to what they are getting at under their side of the house for that. Like, but also, secondly, like we don't think that like weighing up principles after hearing like someone being called out for hypocrisy is actually going to happen, because if we think about your regular person, they're not that compelled to actually look into something. Like maybe I stumble upon an article that said like David Seymour's being a hypocrite. That's probably going to stop there. The majority of people who are actually going to look into these look into these like examples of hypocrisy are people who are already like very strongly opinionated, very activist. Like your more moderate people are probably just not going to look into that. But secondly, the like idea of like what is actually in people's minds already, like it's ingrained in people's minds from the very beginning of what they know and what they know is right and wrong. Second gave us material on that here, but firstly, like under our side of the house, when hypocrisy is ingrained in people's mind as just being bad, that means people see that as a negative thing, because typically hypocrisy is a bad thing. If Christopher Luxon is like saying we need to stop public spending, wasteful spending, and then he gets his big allowance paying for his house even though he does not need it, that is very negative. Most of the examples in like hypocrisy are just very negative. But even if we look at smaller examples of hypocrisy, like Mr. Wilson telling me to take off my jacket in class even though he's wearing a jacket, that just like really annoys people on a regular day-to-day basis. Like people think hypocrisy is just really bad. These small experiences of hypocrisy in people's lives just lead them to feeling it very negatively. So even under their side of the house, when they get hypocrisy, people are going to have this like idea of hypocrisy being negative in the first place, and they're probably just going to have it from there. What does that mean for all of their material there as to like actually their model in itself? It means that it's probably like we've proved that it's just like severely mitigated. That means like a lot of their material just loses its significant weight and power in this debate, as they aren't able to sufficiently prove any of their like major outcomes. Before I move on to my next point, I'll take a PLI.
Does the speaker not think that that calling out someone for being hypocritical has very little impact on their political standing?
I think it does, yes it does call them out for being very like political. I'll be talking about that next. So then, firstly on like the idea of like social impacts, first the idea of like politicians and businesses. No, this was their big push about like politicians and stuff use hypocrisy to like manipulate voters and like change their ways of this. Couple responses here. Firstly, we think that this exists on either side of the house, the attacking of people, which just exists inherently, because this is the way that the best, easiest way to obtain votes. But secondly, we think that calling out hypocrisy actually exists in relation to the policy of the party itself, rather than just like attacking the individual. Like we don't think that saying like Chloe Swarbrick drives a car, oh my god, don't vote for her, that's probably not likely to change the massive impact, because they see these big things already happening. So we don't think that really exists. But then also, what was their analysis on companies? We heard like analysis such as like BP basically guilt tripping people into calling them hypocrites for like things. But like a couple responses here. Firstly, when people are being called hypocrites, it just like makes them really angry because no one wants to be called hypocritical. So this leads to them actually being like angry, and they're like, wait, no, BP is actually being far more hypocritical here. Like they're dumping way more oil into the ocean, and they're like polluting our planet way more. We need to stand up to them. Like we need to call them out for hypocrisy. Like one company calling them out for hypocrisy, as opposed to like millions of people being like, your company is being massively hypocritical. We think like millions of people are far more effective at calling them hypocritical, and this leads to like all the accountability material that Tyler gave you in first. So then, what do we prove at this point for hypocrisy in companies? Firstly, it's that like companies under their side of the house just like don't have this like significant hypocrisy power that they say like guilt tripping voters. But under our side of the house, we gave you all of that analysis as to accountability and how that actually helps people. What was that material? Tyler told you that like when companies are held accountable and called out for hypocrisy, this sends a signal to the companies that they need to change. When they change, that's really beneficial. And like, let's do a comparative here, right? Like under Neg's world, what's going to happen? Like we never got stepped through exactly how these companies were going to like specifically change under their side of the house. None of that material was brought through, but we stepped that through out under our side of the house, because when companies are called out for being hypocritical, there is that massive negative stigma. They are forced to change because they do not want to be seen in the public eyes as being an evil, like pernicious company. So then, onto like social effects and social movements. Their big push on social movements was basically like, people can't be a part of social movements because if I'm a part of the environmentalist movement and I drive a car, I can't be a part of it. Firstly, we think that we can just like sense check this. Like we think it's a little bit ridiculous that you're being like absolutely excluded from this movement just because you're like driving a car. Firstly, we think that people can still raise awareness for this. And without looking hypocritical. This looks like me, like starting to be far more sustainable, like bringing a reusable water bottle to work, reducing the amount of times I use my car, taking more work. Like once you go to the workplace, people can start taking you more seriously. It might be like, oh, look at like, oh, Janice from work like is an environmentalist and she's taking all of these steps to become more environmental. That really inspires people, and we don't think that like calling them out for being hypocritical just exists. But also secondly, But also secondly to this, it's just that like even if you want to buy all of the material on this and like locking these people out of social movements, we think that under their side of the house, they're probably likely not going to get this because there's going to be far less cohesion. Because if it, like at the point where the social movement calls the other, like the opposing movement that they're going against hypocritical, there's just like this big grey area of just like, well, we're both hypocritical, neither's really better. They need to deal with that under their side of the house. That means that material is severely mitigated. So then, onto my split on like how there's increased pressures on vulnerable groups in society. What do we have to understand at the beginning of this point? Currently in the status quo, there's extremely like major pressures that act on vulnerable groups in society. For example, take like an Instagram like internet mum who like posted a video of herself like giving like store-bought donuts to her kid for breakfast. This led to like massive comments in the comment section being like, oh my god, you're such a horrible mother, you need to like stop feeding your children. As opposed, like who was making these comments? Rich white mums who come from far wealthier backgrounds who probably do the same thing to their kids, and they post the same videos, but in the comment section of those videos it's like, oh my god, you're such a good mum. Like that hypocrisy just exists. So here's why it's worse under their side of the house. Firstly, like rich and wealthy people just have a lot more like status and power in society. They hold more weight with what they say. Secondly, more vulnerable people do not have this weight in society, so they're already disadvantaged to call these people out. Thirdly, we don't have the accountability that we have on our side of the house under their side of the house for being like hypocritical. Fourthly, this then leads to like people not being able to call out people for this like in society. For example, like take a woman who was like screamed at for being like dramatic even though all she did was raise her voice. Under their side of the house, that's probably likely not to be called out. Under our side of the house, we can do that. We can call them out for that, for being massively hypocritical. Under their side of the house, because it's not stigmatized, when a woman is likely to call it out under their side of the house, they're probably just likely to be led to being more dramatic, and that's just even more further harmful onto the woman. Outcomes of this, what do we prove at the end of this point? Firstly, vulnerable groups are just like far worse off, and there's no like movement to their movements. So, like the impacts of this is so harmful because the scale of impact is like the minority communities in society. They're extremely vulnerable, and once they're able to not do this, they're left and they can't continue and move with the movements. That pertains to all of their social movement material.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I now welcome up the third speaker of the Affirmative group.
I think there are sort of two broad stumbling blocks that the Neg case is struggling with. And that's that it assumes that a hypocritical action is always going to have negative outcomes, which fundamentally doesn't really work. And then it also assumes that the only way to call someone out on either side of the house is through calling them a hypocrite. But I don't think that really engages with our material. So we've seen two major points of clash here. We've got this idea of kind of discussion of issues and the wider societal impacts on like politics, on businesses, and how people are going to react to that. And then we've got this sort of radicalization and people effects. But I think that this first one is significantly more important, and it kind of weighs a lot more highly in this debate because of the amount of people that it affects. So what have we kind of seen here? The broad material that we've given you is the idea that what we have when we don't have hypocrisy is people evaluating actions of businesses and of politicians on the merits of their actions and not based off of whether they were being hypocritical or not. The main response they've got is this idea that essentially all hypocritical actions are inherently negative. But we think that a hypocritical action, an action that is inherently hypocritical, can still have positive impacts. Affirmative action is hypocritical because it is fighting discrimination with a form of discrimination. But it's not bad. We think that instead on our side of the house, we're seeing people evaluating it based off of merit, looking into it more deeply and seeing that, look, even if this is hypocritical, I'm not necessarily seeing it negatively, and I'm instead seeing it positively. That's the material we've given you, and because their case assumes that, like, a hypocritical action is inherently a negative action, they've sort of been unable to engage with this. So what we have on our side of the house is instead people, like, looking at ideas more critically, thinking about ideas, and thinking about how they're going to impact everybody in society, leading to more like nuanced beliefs. And the outcomes here are simply people giving more realistic and more nuanced ideas of things, and people understanding issues on a more deep level, so that we have a lot less divide, which builds into the radicalization point, which is in the second point of clash. And the other thing that they've given us here is that the only way that we're able to call out injustice is through hypocrisy. That like the only way that we can call out the US's climate inaction is through when they call out NUA for its climate inaction, and then us saying, no, look, you're being hypocritical. But what do we see on our side of the house, and what responses have we given you to this here? We fundamentally believe that it is better for us to be calling out someone for their actions and for their negative actions and the effect this is having on people, rather than it is for just calling them out because they're being hypocritical. Because this means that A, we can call out actions that are hypocritical and have like still positive outcomes. We can talk about the positive outcomes that come from that. And also simply because it's going to provide more discussion and more productive discussion when we talk about the outcomes of an issue. This looks like we no longer have politicians just calling their opposition hypocritical, and that's the end of the discussion, like accusing them of ideology, as Chloe calls it. And instead, we're actually talking about, well, hold on, even if their argument is hypocritical, they're still actually providing a benefit for society. And we see that as a gross benefit. So this point ends up kind of at worst being a wash if you believe that somehow the benefit of discussion between an actual nuanced discussion and calling them hypocritical is the same. But we actually believe that discussing someone's actual beliefs and discussing how they affect people is significantly better and leads to significantly better outcomes for society. Because then you have people voting on issues in a more nuanced manner, voting on issues in a more educated manner, and that's going to lead to better outcomes for society. And then what do we have on companies here? On companies, we told you that in like the best marketing stunt in human history, BP managed to spill 4 million barrels of oil in the Gulf of Mexico and convince everyone else it was their fault with the carbon footprint, which they invented, and then convinced everyone that it is hypocritical for you to be pro-climate action because you're the problem for climate action. You driving your car is the reason that we have world temperatures raised by 2 degrees, not our 4 million barrels of oil. And what we have on our side of the house is when we no longer see hypocrisy as an inherently bad thing, we no longer have these people feeling like, well, if I call them out, that would be hypocritical because I drive my car everywhere. They instead are able to look at it in a genuinely nuanced way and see that, look, even if I'm driving my car to the place that I'm calling them out, their scale of harm is significantly higher than mine. And so we see more calling out of companies. We see companies actually being held to account for their actions because they're no longer able to convince people it's their fault. Because we are able to have people understand that even if what they're doing is hypocritical, even if while standing for climate action they are driving a gas-guzzling car, they're still actually having a net good. And we see that as a major, major positive because we're no longer able to simply dismiss a movement or dismiss an idea because it is hypocritical. We dismiss an idea because it's bad. You're no longer called out for being hypocritical in your ideas. You're called out for your ideas causing harms, either as a company or as a politician. And the wider societal impact of this is actually we just see companies and politicians behaving in a better way. We see companies and politicians actually putting through bills that are going to benefit people because we're having more nuanced political discussion, and we see companies being held to account more for their actions because they're not able to just dismiss their actions under the guise of telling everyone else it's their fault. And before I move on to my second point of clash, I'll take a point.
I gave you material as to why the majority of the moderate population just won't look into issues past being hypocritical. How does any of the material illustrate that?
Well, that actually helps us. That is a concession on your side of the house because you're telling us that people don't care about the actual beliefs. They only care about hypocrisy, which is on your side of the house. They see hypocrisy and don't look into the belief. Whereas on our side of the house, they don't have hypocrisy to care about. Hypocrisy is not stigmatized. So instead, they're actually going to look into the beliefs because it's not muddying the discussion, as we told you at first, with these talks of hypocrisy, which actually don't add anything to the discussion. So let's move into that second point of clash, being essentially the effects on people. The mix we gave you are essentially that when you are brought up and you see yourself as like a liberal or a right-winger, or you see yourself as someone who questions the government, and you see questioning the government as part of your identity, you now immediately see the government is doing something, I have to question it, i.e. the government is getting us to take vaccines, I should question that. And so what we see on our side of the house is people being forced into a radical political ideology because they believe that that's the only way that they can not be hypocritical. That it will be hypocritical of them to call themselves a conservative and yet support vaccine mandates. Whereas, using the mechs we told you in the first point of clash, if we can actually think about this view and think about what vaccine mandates are doing for society, you're now no longer seeing, well, that's a hypocritical action, I can't support it. You're supporting an action based off of what you actually believe. So why are we not going to see radicalization on our side of the house? Because fundamentally, we're no longer going to have people feeling like they're pushed into one pigeonhole of a political belief. They're able to have nuanced political beliefs on lots of different issues because we are supporting people deciding their beliefs based off of actual harms and not principles. When you decide your beliefs based off of principles, you push people into a specific political ideology defined by the radical left and radical right, which leads to radicalization, which leads to less social cohesion. We haven't really heard a lot of engagement from the other side of the house, so we very clearly won this point of clash because the only thing that they've told us is that people don't like being called hypocritical, and so they're going to call out other people, they're going to call out a company for being hypocritical when they're called hypocritical by the company. But we don't think that works because the company has so much more power, they have so much more marketing to convince everybody that it is their fault for climate change. And so we broadly think that people are going to be less radicalized and have more nuanced beliefs. We support a world where people have nuanced, correct beliefs which actually support what they believe in, rather than a world where people simply believe it because it's not hypocritical.
Speaker for their speech, then I welcome up the third speaker from the negating team to close the substantive portion of this debate. You can just unplug it if you like.
When a person is told to do a certain action, but the person who is telling them to do that is not doing that action, we think they fail to see that this action is achievable in the first place and that there is any value in actually doing this action. Therefore, when hypocrisy is not a norm and is not stigmatized, when hypocrisy is not a norm and when it is not stigmatized, people don't fail to realize the value of the actions and why and how change can actually be achieved. 3 things I'm going to be doing for you today in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to be addressing this kind of point on the kind of actions versus principles clash that we've seen arising. Secondly, I'm going to look on how hypocrisy makes people feel. And finally, I'm going to look at the different ways that both sides of the house look to achieve change. So firstly, on this kind of actions versus principles point, which is this clashes has kind of arisen, where we've seen the F side tell us that, people are going to be called out because their actions do not match with their principles, whereas on the next side of the house, we've been telling you that the reason that people are going to be called a hypocrite is because their actions are not matching the actions they tell you to do. So why then do we think that in general, actions are going to be playing both easier to change and are going to be playing a more important role in this debate? So firstly, we tell you that they're going to be easier to change because principles have been ingrained in a person from a really young age, and they're taught that some things are morally right or wrong. We don't think this is likely to change very quickly. What this means in the context of the examples they give you is that someone's far more likely to actually look to change their actions around the environment rather than just stop driving their car in general. Therefore, we on our side of the house are actually able to achieve change. But secondly, why do we think that people are going to care about a politician's actions more than their principles? Because actions actually have concrete effects on a citizen's life. We tell you that when Christopher Luxon is receiving all this money for his house, but when he's telling you to like stop like spending at the same time, this action is going to have far more impact on people's lives because they like can see the concrete effects of money rather than just some vague principle in general. So we tell you that in the end, when it comes to hypocrisy, people care more about calling a person out for their actions, because this is when it has like concrete effects on a person's life, than calling them out for their principles. We think this quite effectively deals with the material they've told you about how politicians like to call people out and say, oh, they're being a hypocrite because their actions don't like match with their principles. We tell you in the end, actions alone matter far more and are more likely to be like what is targeted by this. So then how does this like actually make people feel? So we've told you two things about like hypocrisy, and how this works. So we've told you that when like a person is told to do someone who is like being a hypocrite, they feel like it is unjust, and this has two consequences. Firstly, they lose trust in institutions because they feel like things are untrust. The government isn't my voice anymore because they're not actually looking to change their ways and model correct behaviour. They're not representative of my views. Note that when this occurs, this is when we get the shifts to the left and to the right that they've told you like occurs exclusively on our side of the house. We tell you it occurs worse on their side when people feel like their governments are now disconnected and the institutions are like not in touch with the people, which has occurred. Alternatively, we are able to call this out on our side of the house when we tell you that like, hey, look, this behaviour you're modelling is not the behaviour you're telling us to model. We tell you that like on our side of the house, this is when we are able, and we then tell you that this like has an effect on the governments because they have like this democratic accountability. Therefore, that stuff is actually able to change and people are more likely to remain engaged in the institutions. But secondly, we tell you that when a person like is told you need to like change your actions, when the person who is telling them to do so isn't actually modelling their action, what it tells them is that this action isn't actually achievable. Like for example, when the USA is telling small countries you should change your carbon emissions, but they can't do it themselves, it tells these small countries, well, if this really rich, powerful country can't do anything, we don't think we can either. This leads to people feeling like they have no power, there's no point in changing their actions anyway, and so any kind of social benefit on changing your actions is not achieved. Okay, and then we have this idea of like people feel like they have to question the government. We tell you that just questioning the government alone is actually a really, really good thing that we would love to claim on our side of the house. But we don't think just because someone's questioning the government, they're going to like start believing in conspiracy theories. They still like learn science. There's still a general pressure from the public to not engage in this sort of stuff because then you're seen as like a crackhead or like a nut job who wears a tinfoil hat. So we don't think just because they're questioning the government, they're going to start believing in conspiracy theories. However, we do think that we agree with their claim that people are going to start questioning the government in general. So why is this a really good thing? Because again, it means that we can hold the governments to account. We can ensure that the policy they like want to push forward and the actions that a politician is holding actually like reflect. It means that like a politician can be held to account for their actions. It means that the policy they push forward is again like representative of the people and like what they claim they stand for. So what we've proved at the end of this point is that we do get questioning of the government, but that this was really effective and that people feel like and when like hypocrisy exists, people are able to like call out things that they feel is wrong. I'll take your POA.
Why do you believe that discussion about a government being hypocritical is going to be more productive than discussion about a government's actions and the effect it's having on people?
Because when a government's actions and the effect that they're having on people are like hypocritical and like converse to what they've been telling you should be doing, like when, for example, we've given you this example of Christopher Luxon, when those actions are like affecting people and like, leading to more tax cuts despite him telling you like stop the wasteful spending, this is when we're actually able to achieve the nuanced policy change that you've pushed so hard for on your side of the house then. So now we're going to look at like further ways that change is actually achieved on both sides of the house. Here we've been presented with a counter model, which is we're going to focus on their actions and just like the harms they have instead. Why do we think that this is not like an effective model? We tell you firstly that focusing on like the harm something has is not exclusive to their side of the house. We can claim it too. Why is this? Because when a person's actions, when a person's hypocritical actions have really massive harms, this is the point at which hypocrisy gains a lot of power, and we're actually able to put pressure on these people and change things. We heard this BP example, and they said, oh, look, BP has so much power, they can just convince people that they're the problem. We tell you that on the other side of on our side of the house, obviously, who's the bigger hypocrite? You for saying, oh, you should like care for the environment, but I'm driving a car, or them when they're saying you should care for the environment, but we've just destroyed like the entire ocean with our oil spills. We tell you hypocrisy works both ways, and when a company's actions is clearly worse than whatever you've been doing, it's far easier to call them out on hypocrisy, and we also say that we can still just in general call them out on the really bad effects that they're having. Note that BP also has the public accountability they've told you, so when we kind of get this mass support, we think that it can be very effective. And secondly, we tell you that having hypocrisy stops people from just doing this really performative action. We've heard from them, oh, it's okay to support the environmental movement and drive a car. We tell you if you claim you're a so-called environmentalist, but you're not actually doing anything to save the environment or change your action, then we say that hypocrisy is very beneficial and that it's a way you're actually able to concretely achieve change. It's all very well and good to have these principles, but unless you're actually taking some form of action to show that you care about this stuff, we say it's all in the end relatively useless, and we just get these people saying they're being environmental, but they're just doing it for the aesthetic to show they're trendy instead of actually making a change. So on our side of the house, we're the only side that's able to prove that concrete change can actually be achieved, which is why, despite what my coaches fear, I'm so proud to oppose.
You're okay, leave it. It's okay. I'd like the speaker for their speech. As is customary, we'll now reverse the speaking order, and I invite Neg for their leader's reply. You can just leave. Yeah, it's okay. Thank you. Yeah, I've been challenging you.
People feel injustice when they are encountered with people telling them to do certain things or not do certain things that they don't do themselves. When they're told to follow a certain set of rules that the rule maker doesn't follow themselves. Ultimately, when we start to engage with these forms of hypocrisy and hold it to account, we're able to achieve better outcomes. Three clear clashes in this then. Firstly, how do people react to hypocrites? Secondly, do people care more about principle or action? And then lastly, which side achieves change? Firstly then, on how do people react to hypocrites. We've said substantively that people feel like their institutions aren't in touch with them when they start to engage with these forms of hypocrisy. We gave you we said throughout the bench that Chris Luxon taking a subsidy for paying for his apartment is pretty harmful, even though he claims that he wants to cut down on funding. When we were able to engage with this form of hypocrisy and tell Chris Luxon that what he's doing is hypocritical and that it's harmful in the sense that he's going against his own principle with his actions, because we can engage with that hypocrisy and tell him that what he's doing is wrong, we were able to see the outcome of him actually engaging with this and doing what the public wanted. Ultimately, what their side had to contend with throughout this debate is the fact that the people feel disenfranchised in the sense that their governments are not doing necessarily what they want them to do. We say that a lot of the material that they said about, judging people and institutions based on their actual merits is symmetrical in the sense that we can claim that and say that, look, we're happy to judge people on their actual policy agenda, and we're also happy to judge them on the hypocrisy under which they engage. We also told you that these people can't feel like that they cannot pursue action if the people who tell them to pursue this action don't as well. This means that when you see BP dumping lots and lots of gallons of oil in the Gulf or whatever, what you end up seeing, and then calling people hypocrites because they drive cars, ultimately we say no, this just doesn't work in the sense that if they are cutting down on their emissions, that's them cutting down on emissions. That doesn't mean that you have to stop driving cars. It just means that you have to cut down on what you're doing to make a contribution to climate action. Ultimately, that material falls out in the sense that BP is on the sense that companies have a much greater power to deal with hypocrisy, in the sense that people within the public can uprise and all recognise one issue within that. So ultimately, because we're able to win this point on how do people react to hypocrites, in the sense that we're able to have better reactions on our side because we're able to lead to better change, then we get the outcomes of people feeling more trust within their government and more able to address accountability. So then, on to, do people care more about principle or action? We heard substantively throughout their case that people are called out because their actions don't always align with their principles. Ultimately, we think that their principle and their actions are equally important, in the sense that when you start to engage in, when your policy is to engage in climate action, like Chloe Swarbrick saying that she doesn't like climate change, that she wants to reduce the impact of it, but yet she still drives a car. Ultimately, the fact that she stands for reducing climate change in the first place is really important. But also, we'd like to reinforce that even if that wasn't important, that we're able to get her to probably stop driving a car, in the sense that if we think it's so harmful that she's driving a car and being a hypocrite, then that's up for the public to decide that that's a harmful thing, which means that ultimately we're able to say that they care more about the principle and the action, in the sense that they're an equal harm. So we say that we win this, and that we're able to get more engagement with the public, and we're able to get people to buy in more. Then lastly, on which side achieves change, I addressed this mostly in my first point on how people react to hypocrites, but ultimately because we get more public buy-in and more people willing to engage with their institutions and with their governments, we're able to get more change, and we're able to for people to feel less disenfranchised. So proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I now welcome up the affirmative leaders to close this debate.
This is a debate which is about changing the perception of hypocrisy, so I think it's a little strange when the affirming team stands up and claims, well, people will feel really hard done by and harmed by hypocrisy, when we are changing the way people feel about hypocrisy. We think in our world they will not feel as harmed or hard done by as hypocrisy. This is something we gave you at first when we tell you that the narrative that hypocrisy is harmful is changed. Right? We also told you at first very clearly that hypocrisy is is a narrative, something which you fundamentally believe, and it is something you use to make judgments about certain actions. So we think that is something which broadly stands in the debate. So first of all, on accountability and the way that people hold things accountable, they told us that we can still get lots of really good accountability because they'll just look at the scale of hypocrisy and then they'll tell us, well, actually that people can judge that rationally. We think, first of all, this is always better on our side, because you just remove the middleman of hypocrisy. Now, rather than having to go through, the scale of hypocrisy is different, you just think, the scale of harm is very different, so we think that is better there. But also notice what we told you on the way politicians and companies use hypocrisy. We gave you two things here. First of all, we explained how politicians use it as a personal attack. They say that they always use these as personal attacks, but we think that because hypocrisy is something which is ingrained in individuals' minds, it is a uniquely powerful form of personal attack, which is able to convince people that they shouldn't support specific claims. Second of all, they told you, well, BP can't really change people's minds by pointing out their personal hypocrisy, because they'll just make the way up between 4 million barrels of oil in their car. But what we told you is that these companies have a lot of advertising power to change that narrative in their favour, and they can do this uniquely by pointing out hypocrisy, because it is a way to personally shift that burden. In our world, we think that people are more likely to make a way up between 4 million barrels of oil versus their car when they don't think that they're personally accountable for that on the same level, because hypocrisy is something which weighs heavily in their mind. Note here, some of this, the stratification which occurs in this debate. Suppose that there is a certain, baseline level of hypocrisy which occurs. Some of that hypocrisy is going to be harmful, some of it isn't going to be harmful. In their world, all hypocrisy must be called out because people believe that fundamentally hypocrisy is something which is harmful. The degree to which that happens can vary. However, there will always be some people who are calling out that hypocrisy is bad. The difference is that on our world, you cut out hypocrisy entirely, and you make that judgment just on the basis of whether or not that thing was good or bad, right? You make that way up there, and we think it is always better to make the way up at that point. We'd also like to note that they were talking about, right? Yeah, so we don't think that when someone does something, and finally, secondly, we'd like to make a second way up here. So they were talking about, gas guzzling cars, getting people to stop. We explained that, people do these things because they're useful, so they're probably unlikely to change them. Therefore, when you create a world where hypocrisy, they're told they're hypocritical if they go and support this movement, they're probably unlikely to want to go and support that specific movement because they do not want to make that change to their specific lifestyle. So we think actually we are the side which gets better personal action because you no longer feel called out on a personal level and rather feel empowered to make changes on the basis of your principle. You'll go out and get that water bottle because you feel like you're not like some massive hypocrite, rather you're someone who is trying to make a small change in a small way. If they wanted to change, to support people making judgments based on how proportionally harmful something is, that is something which always falls on our side of the house. Finally, on radicalization, we think that broadly this material was unengaged with, and if the first point is a wash, it could be significant. The point of radicalization was that when someone feels like they have a certain set of beliefs, they're not going to deviate from that set of beliefs because they feel like they would be a hypocrite. However, when you remove that barrier, they are more likely to make individual judgments on the basis of the merits of a policy, and that is what side affirming always supports: individuals making judgment based on ideas rather than hypocrisy on ideas.
I thank the speaker for their speech and a great debate. I think we just will head out sometime.
Handshake. Here we go. I'm sorry for that. I definitely replied to that thing I said to dinner, but I did lie a little bit. I did lie. Me when my